Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you so much for being here, especially on such a beautiful evening in August. I promise to end promptly at 5:58, so we can all get on with our evening, which is lovely out. So I wanted to start with a quote here from Robert Macfarlane. Has anybody read Robert Macfarlane? He is an amazing, he's a British author. He has a book out now asking whether or not a river is alive, which you'll see kind of comes back a couple of times throughout the course of the last 15 years that I've been working. But this quote, this idea that wonder is this essential skill for the Anthropocene, is a good starting point for us, because as we know, the world that we inhabit is changing very quickly. And so my kind of motivation, which we'll get kind of into the backstory of, but my motivation as it exists now is to help us understand that change, how the Earth is changing ecologically, culturally, socially, really through the lens of film and science. So I am a great admirer of fish. This is me as a 6-year-old catching fish, and not with my grandfather. Not long after this, I really kind of started to turn that camera towards the natural world, and ever since then I've been hooked to the point where this is me actually a few years ago at another dam removal in the great state of Montana, scuba diving in about 6 feet of water, which I figure Rhode Islanders would appreciate, because most of my colleagues at the University of Rhode Island are always curious as to why I would get a scuba certification to go into fresh water, especially water that's only 6 feet deep. Turns out this is why. This is a 40-inch bull trout up in the headwaters of the Blackfoot River in Montana. Part of the work that I've been involved in over the last decade plus has been looking at rivers and river health, and specifically river restoration. So here I am snorkeling with a fish that is long as my leg, which the last time a fish was as long as my leg that I was able to photograph was, when I was 6, as you saw in the front there. So that has led me, that kind of love of the outdoors, that love of witnessing the world around me, especially the natural world, got me into has really gotten me into a fair amount of trouble over the years. As you heard, I've worked for National Geographic, The Atlantic, PBS, really being able to go out into the world and find experts and go to incredible locations to see, yes, things like giant carnivorous bats. And in the process of that, have come back with stories. Those stories have been, published across a broad range of publications and as my own films, which have kind of gone into film festivals, have been syndicated by, digital publications, by television stations, etc. So before we get to the two projects that I really wanted to kind of update you on, introduce you to, I wanted to show just a brief moment of how that kind of translates to my work as a professor at URI. So I run a lab within the Harrington School called the Science and Story Lab, which is a really fun way of working with researchers, of being able to actually work with my colleagues to help do kind of impact-driven science communication, to help bring the stories of their research to broader audiences, which allows me to interface with students. A lot of the students that come through my door are interested, everyone kind of sees the yellow rectangle and says, now how do I work for them? So I get a number of students who come through saying, like, I really want to work for National Geographic. I see that, kind of read your bio, I see the things that you're able to do, and I'm really motivated by that. And I've had the great opportunity of folding those students into these productions, which I'll touch a little bit more on later. And then really being able to work with community partners as well. And just wanted to mention a slide that I didn't include in here, but that is a really cool resource, is where this was taken. This was actually a short video that was produced for PBS Learning Media, which is a kind of nationally, it still remarkably has survived, considering all that's happening now. But PBS Learning Media is a unique video-driven platform for K-12 educators, really for science classrooms and history classrooms. All types of different curricula exist on there, where teachers, K-12 teachers across the country, are able to access short videos for engaging their students in those classrooms. we just launched 2 short videos on that platform, which actually receives about 1 million unique views a month. A lot of eyeballs see these little shorts. So I had a group of students over a number of semesters that produced 2 videos up there about research that is happening. This may look familiar to some of you in the background there. It's right down the hill at the Graduate School of Oceanography. There was a big consortium of researchers who have been studying over the last 6 or 7 years, and some even longer, the effects of microplastics and, you know, more recently nanoplastics as well, their accumulation in Narragansett Bay. So students, a group of students and I were able to document some of that research, interview both graduate students, as you see in this frame here, as well as the researchers. My students were able then to edit those videos into a final short, really kind of framed and delivered for 9th to 11th grade audience, and now those are out in the world in PBS. So the Science and Story Lab is this really kind of fun vehicle to pair the 2 things that I really have enjoyed doing, which is working with young people as a mentor and as a professor, as well as actually get to go out and do the work, which does usually include them getting to shoot sea urchins or actually getting out over in over by Fort Wetherill and actually getting them in the water, and then being able to work with things like the American burying beetle up in Providence at a conservation-based breeding program there. So field work is the goal here, to get students out doing that. And then it all kind of comes together through that. So it's a little bit of background here. But what I wanted to really talk about today was 2 stories that I've just finished that have taken a number of years to kind of pull together. One in our own backyards and one about as far away as you can get on the planet. And those 2 stories have really allowed me the opportunity to spend time holding these kind of 2 ideas in my head at the same time. One is, how do you motivate kind of and tell the story of community-based action? Again, going back to that Robert McFarlane quote about the world changing very quickly. How do you kind of showcase and celebrate the work that's being done even in the face of climate change locally? And then how do you kind of expand that to a place where really it's very, very challenging for us to visit, and it's a very complex story. So I'm going to take you on a little journey for the next 40 minutes or so to 2 different stories that have just recently come out or are about to come out. So the first one, we'll start in our own backyards. Does anybody recognize this bird by chance? Do we have any birders in here? It's a sparrow, yep. Does anybody know the species of sparrow? This is a salt marsh sparrow, yeah. This tiny little bird, which is a little bit unremarkable if you look at it, right? If one were to fly through the room right now, most of us would probably be like, oh, there's a bird stuck in here. Turns out this bird, though, is a kind of a canary in the coal mine. They are really on the brink of extinction. And it's even some of the most kind of relevant research for this species says that by 2050 they will be extinct, and it's likely by 2030, right? Which is kind of clock's ticking here as far as this bird's kind of life on the planet. And this happens to be where they nest. They nest in the lowest part of the salt marsh, which, as you know, there's a lot of salt marsh habitat still in Rhode Island. But historically, compared to what it was, there really is very, very little left. And so this particular nest is in Warren at a place called Jacob's Point. And these birds come back in the springtime to make their nests and to raise their young in this particular environment. And what's unique to the salt marsh sparrow, as opposed to the Nelson sparrow or a song sparrow, other kinds of other little unremarkable birds that you might see flying around a marsh in the early morning hours, is that they nest just above the tide. They nest in the Spartina alterniflora, which is really just right where the marsh meets the sea. So the elevation where they nest is, centimeters above where a tide will come in and out. So I knew about this story. Candidly, I was on a salt marsh kick. The previous film I had made prior to this one was about saltwater terrapins, which is a kind of turtle that is also quite rare, also lives in this environment. So I had this environment on my mind and was kind of interested in stories of where, the rubber meets the road in terms of conservation and extinction and community-driven action. So I knew a little bit about the salt marsh sparrow and started to kind of reach out to some groups that were working and studying this bird. And they're really quite, despite, I'm saying that they're unremarkable, but in fact, when you really spend time with them and really learn kind of to watch their movements, they do this really remarkable stuff. They're known kind of as the mice of the marsh because they actually walk more than they fly. So I spent 2 breeding seasons coming up with all kinds of clever ways of getting a camera inside of a salt marsh sparrow nest, which are really challenging to find. That first photograph you saw is with one that is actually quite exposed. But it turns out these are it's like finding a needle in a haystack. Everything looks like grass. And so to actually find these nests takes a remarkable amount of time, and luckily this is where the partnership comes in, because as much as I might pretend sometimes, I'm not actually a trained biologist. So my work really relies on a partnership with scientists, which I'll get to in a moment here. But I wanted to just kind of sum up the threat to these birds, why scientists believe they're going to go extinct by 2050. The reason is sea level rise, right? The seas are rising. In fact, they're rising in New England a little bit faster than they are kind of on the global average. And so what that means is that more times during the month and for longer stretches of time, a high tide will come in and actually will flood the marsh. And so this is kind of what that starts to look like, right? The nests that the sparrows lay drown, essentially. And so the most succinct way to summarize this story that I've spent 2 years photographing and filming was I basically spent 2 summers watching baby birds die, which is a little bit of a bummer. So I had to find kind of a spin for that. So this really is the threat for this species, and their population actually has plummeted since the 1990s. The population across their range has dropped by over 75%. And is dropping at about 9% a year, just because these nests are being flooded. The population is not replacing. There's not enough chicks that are replacing the adults. This is the actual threat that will lead to their extinction. And so when you kind of look at the face of it, it's a pretty dire story. And this is across the range. This is not simply in Rhode Island, where the marsh where I was. Their range in the summer runs from Connecticut all the way up to coastal Maine, where there's a lot of marshes, really in the southern half of coastal Maine. So they'll come up and they'll breed up here in the summertime, and then, most smart people, they decide that winter is not the right time to stick around. So they fly all the way down to the Carolinas and to Georgia. What is remarkable, though, before I kind of transition to how I was able to find these nests and the work that's being done to try to stave this fate off for the species, is that individual birds go back and forth to the same place to the same stretch of marsh where they were hatched, which is pretty remarkable. Again, this is a trait that I think of in salmon, right? Salmon go back to their natal streams when they go to spawn, and it turns out that these sparrows, the salt marsh sparrows, will return to the same stretch, often within a several meters radius of where they were hatched. So the population at a particular place, a place like Jacobs Point in Warren, is actually those birds were hatched and raised there. Occasionally you'll get kind of a flyaway, some other bird that drifts in, but for the most part, that population is coming back and forth to the same place. Which, for a bird that weighs all of 2 nickels, to think that they fly on their own power all the way to the Carolinas or to Georgia or to the Florida Panhandle, and then back to the 30-something acres in coastal Rhode Island, to me is again, it goes back to that idea of wonder, right? That is something to showcase and to really sit with and to think about, because it's just this incredible trait for, again, a little bird that when you see it in the hand, you're like, it's a little brown bird. There you go. So to really start to find those nests, I reached out to this incredible group of citizen scientists who run an organization called the Saltmarsh Sparrow Research Initiative, which Deirdre Robinson, who is one of their 3 directors, will tell you the acronym for that is SSRI. For those of anybody in the medical field might see the double entendre there, the joke. SSRIs are antidepressants. So this group for the last 10 plus years had been monitoring these individual birds, right? So the reason I was able to find a nest and to actually get that footage that you saw was by collaborating with this group of citizen scientists who are out there. Deirdre is out there during the breeding season when the birds arrive in the middle of May, basically until about 2 or 3 weeks ago. They all pretty much leave the marsh by August. Deirdre's out there every morning at about 5 o'clock in the morning watching the birds. And the only way you find nests is by putting in time, watching where a female flushes out of the grass and actually going and finding that nest by hand individually at, one at a time, which is a labor of love, to say the least. So once I started to meet Deirdre and learn about the Saltmarsh Sparrow Research Initiative, I immediately was like, this is the kind of story that I've been looking for. This is the story of people who have taken, quite literally the face of extinction. They're looking, kind of into the eyes of extinction for this particular species and are saying, what can we do? What can we do here? What can we do now? And really how that started for them was by doing a population study, just by studying the birds coming back and forth from their kind of wintering habitats back up. So that includes banding them. You can see the little banding on their legs there. And that population study kind of turned into something more over the last couple of years. So the next slide I want to show you is a trailer, a real short, about 2-minute video that just gives you a sense of the marsh and the folks who work both at SSRI and then with SSRI. So let's take a listen here, and I'll ride the sound because it might be a little loud.
I ran across a quote from Shakespeare, which haunts me a little bit. There is a special providence in the fall of the sparrow. Hamlet said this shortly before he died. The population has declined 75% since the 90s. The likelihood is that the species will go extinct by 2035. Flooding is the main contributor to their demise. We'd love to be able to find at least 10 nests that we can lift.
Deirdre's enthusiasm couldn't be diminished. It just grows.
Are they all old enough to band?
This is to certify that Cooper White is a member of the Needle in the Haystack Society, presented today.
This is the definition of hope, that little pink flag. She's a lesson for all of us. She uses what she has.
So over the course of those 2 field seasons, Deirdre and her team, which really was these 3 co-directors who are all retirees who live in Bristol, and then this cadre of interns, right? Just like college professors, the world is built on interns. So they got some interns, and those interns who you saw there are either high school or college students who are interested in field ecology or interested in biology. And this is this great kind of practicum for them to get out in the field. So this small group of people were trying to figure out, like, what do you do in the face of extinction? And since they had all of the data, the population data, and since they had this kind of methodology for finding nests, which was just pure, kind of grunt work, time on the ground, they came up with this really ingenious solution where they would actually use coffee filters, right? $6 really is what they found, this kind of low-cost solution. So when we're talking about seawalls and all the kind of mitigation for the effects of climate change, especially in Rhode Island, the effects of sea level rise. If you read any of the reports from, say, the Newport Historical Society, you'll find that any kind of coastal resilience is very, very expensive, right? So what I found really fascinating about this group was, here's a low-cost solution that I can get at our hardware store for about, $6 to $10. A little bit of PVC, a wooden dowel, and a coffee filter with some foam on it. And what they decided to do, after going through the incredibly laborious process of procuring permits from both Rhode Island DEM, the Department of Environmental Management, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, they were able to identify nests and to actually go out and lift those nests and iterate through this experimentation process over these breeding cycles over the last 3 seasons now. They did it this year again as well, though I wasn't filming it. So they would actually lift very gently after they'd find a nest that was deemed appropriate to lift. Based on its elevation and other factors, they would cut the nest out with a big pair of sheep shears and then very gently place it into this coffee filter. And what they discovered was that the females are so motivated to hatch these eggs and to raise these nestlings to the point where they get out of the nest that they actually don't mind this interference. There are other species who, as soon as you got this close, they would abandon a nest and leave it and not return. Not so with the salt marsh sparrows. The salt marsh sparrows return every single time. And so this type of kind of intervention, they deemed appropriate and they deemed it effective. So they actually went out and figured out whether or not these things would work. And through this iteration process I mentioned, they figured out that if you put this coffee filter with the foam pads, which if any of you have children or grandchildren, this is just the foam pads of those letters that you put on a kindergarten floor. That's what those pads actually are. So cut out and with the dowel through them, it provides enough float, and then a PVC pipe will actually keep it in place. So that the effect is when the tide, these bigger tides that we're receiving either on a big moon tide or on a king tide, will come in and completely flood the marsh. There won't actually be any ground available. Everything will be underwater, and yet this little nest arc, is what they call it, will actually float up and then float back down with the tide, just like the buoy, right? Just like a mooring ball. And so to watch this process happen over the last 2 seasons has been remarkable. And actually they've had a remarkable amount of success with this in terms of nests that they've saved that otherwise would have flooded during these big tidal events. They're actually taking all of that data and are currently working on publishing that data in a scientific journal. Which for me, the kind of the motivating factor here again was, here's a group of citizens, right? Citizen scientists, this group of retirees, and then this group of young interns who, again, staring extinction in the face, said, well, maybe not on our watch. What if we could try something? And so they went out and have been trying it. So the culmination of that 2 years, in addition to some of these photographs, was a short film that premiered in May at a film festival in Colorado, and will be kind of on the film festival circuit over the next several months. Over the course of this, I actually had the real pleasure of getting to know folks from the Redford Center, which is a nonprofit based in San Francisco that was started by Robert Redford and his late son, Jamie Redford, who saw an early cut of this project and believed in it and helped it kind of get over the finish line, which was really remarkable to see that other people were motivated by these kind of climate solution stories as well. Additionally, the film, which currently isn't available anywhere because it's in the film festival circuit, etc., is going to run on The Guardian out of the UK as part of their special documentary series in about 3 weeks, or less than that now. September 7th, the film premieres on The Guardian, in which case it will be free, it will be accessible, it will be able to be accessed by the general public through The Guardian's website. So that's Between Moon Tides, which again was this very local story. I think I calculated it all up when I was doing kind of the fundraising for it. And these guys, I spent about a very small percentage of the time that Deirdre spends in the marsh, but I still spent about 45 days over the course of 2 years in the field shooting this kind of project. Which usually, to get back to students, usually the rubber meets the road at the point when students ask, well, how long did it take you to make that 25-minute film? How much footage do you have? And I tell them, well, this film actually only has about 55 hours of footage, all told, to cut down into a 20-minute final product. So they're like, oh my God, yeah, that's maybe not what I want to do. But the ones that do see that, I've been able to take some of them into the field to go see this place. So that's a unique opportunity for them, and usually a great help for me, especially as my back gets worse and the equipment somehow gets heavier. So the next place I want to take you is not in our backyard. And a project came to me that I was trying to wrap my head around because it really, at first glance, it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And it really kind of expanded the boundaries of how I was thinking about how we would relate to a place. It was so, the salt marsh is a very kind of visceral place where to spend time in there, you learn what it sounds like, what it feels like underfoot, what it smells like, all while you're out there shooting. The next story is about this lovely potato-sized rock, which was a little bit of a jump for me. This is a smaller one, but this is a polymetallic nodule from the abyssal plain in the middle of the Pacific, which may sound like a string of non sequitur words. So let's unpack that a little bit. Has anybody heard of a polymetallic nodule before? Yeah, one? Okay, great. So I'm going to tell you a story about rocks that breathe. This tiny rock is from, again, the abyssal plain, the very bottom of the ocean, which if we step back for a sec, again, going back to that quote about wonder, the abyssal plain, the very bottom of the sea, that kind of sandy, mucky bottom, if you were to add up all of the different habitats on the planet, the salt marshes, the mountain ranges, the rivers where I've snorkeled, the mountains I've climbed, all that kind of stuff, everything that we know on the surface, and then everything that's underneath the ocean, turns out the abyssal plain is about 35%. It's a third of the habitat on the planet. And in many places, it's populated by these funny-looking potato-sized rocks. Now, they're called polymetallic nodules because they're made up of different metals, multiple metals, hence the poly and the metallic. And these rocks are, in fact, kind of everywhere, and they kind of do this amazing thing. They are the product of an amazing process, I should say. So most of them max out at about this big, and they are often tens of millions of years old, which is crazy to think about, that you can actually slice one of these things open and look at geologic time passing. These nodules, in fact, formed in an ancient ocean that no longer even exists. So if you picture for a moment the bottom of the sea, which admittedly is a challenging thing to do, hence I'll give you a visual of what this looks like. In that ancient sea, you would have a piece of organic matter that would eventually drift down all the way to the bottom. Let's say like a shark tooth or a piece of bone, something like that. And over millennia, over millions of years even, you would get different metals that would precipitate out of the water and latch onto this organic material. And that over time would grow. Imagine a pearl, right? Growing little bit by little bit, layer by layer, over millions of years. So these polymetallic nodules do this really, are kind of, like I said, the product of this really wild process, this process that began in this ancient ocean. And they lay down on the bottom of the bottom of the sea in droves. This is from a place in South Carolina, where they kind of litter the seafloor. And we've known about these things actually since the original oceanographic expedition, which was the HMS Challenger in the 1880s. They did a bunch of dredging in the Pacific and pulled up these kind of rocks to the point where they stopped really describing them because they were so common. So it turns out they are everywhere, and you kind of wonder, cool, great, got it, potato-sized rocks on the seafloor. What's so special about that? There's a couple of things here. One is that they provide substrate. They actually provide surface for all kinds of life. And that's stuff that we can see. This is from a research expedition. This is habitat for all kinds of creatures that live on the bottom. But then this also is habitat for all kinds of microbes, things we can't see, which are chronically understudied because no one can see them, and they're not cool shrimp, or they're not birds, they're not bears or polar bears, or things that otherwise scientists want to go study. They are... and yet they hold an immense story about kind of how life is formed on Earth, and the processes that these microbes go through. Turns out is actually quite interesting. So we were thinking, I had learned about these rocks and was thinking about producing a story about them with a colleague of mine. This is Claire Fiesler, who's a freelance reporter, and at this point, now is a freelance reporter. At this time, she was working for the Charleston Post and Courier. And here we are actually working with, this is Dr. Jason Chater, who was, he studies the bottom of the seafloor out at Woods Hole. And he'd been looking at these rocks because of this really interesting thing. See, it turns out that these polymetallic nodules are the subject of this decades-long quest to mine them. The metals that are actually in there tend to be manganese, cobalt, and nickel. And does anybody drive an electric car? Okay, so one of the pitches from mining companies about these really interesting, rocks, once you get to know them, otherwise these very boring rocks, is that there turns out that they are full of the metals that we need to electrify our economy. So you'll see mining companies, CEOs from those mining companies hold up these rocks and say something like, this is a Tesla battery in a rock. And it turns out they're all over the sea floor. They're just everywhere. So let's go pick them up. And the scientist, Jason Chater, was interested and actually found, because it had been lost by the U.S. government, somewhat surprisingly, I suppose, this old mining site. In fact, the first test mining site in the world happened right off the coast of South Carolina. Well, right off, this is about 110 miles off the coast of South Carolina, in a place called the Blake Plateau in the 70s. Okay? And this is going to come back up because that 50 years ago, this company came together. They proposed this method of pulling these polymetallic nodules off the bottom of the ocean and turning those minerals into something that the market could use, actually creating a market or supplementing the market for those metals. Turns out this mining site had been near lost. So through Dr. Chater's work, he actually kind of figured out where these were. He found this kind of rumor, went on this wild goose chase to figure out where this company, private company, had actually gone out and looked for these deep sea nodules as early as the 1970s, 50 years ago. Fast forward, middle of COVID, Dr. Chater had funding from NOAA and the National Science Foundation to take a modern research vessel and go back out and look at what he looks at, which is disturbance on the seafloor. Okay? And what he found was absolutely remarkable. This is over a mosaic of over 500,000 photographs, okay, from all up and down this section of the Blake Plateau. Does this make anybody think of anything? Yeah. To me, it looks like train tracks, right? When you kind of scale it back out, it looks to me like train tracks. And he told us that he was amazed that once he started to put this together, not only could you see this, but it looked as though these miners had been there yesterday. And this was in the 1970s, the very first experimentation of that. So what does that tell you about recovery on the seafloor? It doesn't really happen, right? It doesn't happen on anything approximating a human life, the scale of human life. So we were pondering that story, right? Pondering this idea of what it meant to start to think about electrifying our economy using these polymetallic nodules if recovery is not possible. And what that, the conversation that my colleague and I started was really about, shrimp, all the things that live there. Like what unforeseen consequences will we have by just, vacuuming or scooping all these things up off the seafloor and taking them away. Well, about a year ago, a paper was published in Nature Geosciences that completely reframed our thinking about this, which was dark oxygen. Did anybody hear about dark oxygen last year? It was a blip in the news cycle, and admittedly, the news cycle is getting faster, and so it's perfectly possible to have missed it. But this paper was published, and for a brief moment in time, kind of blew up the internet. Mostly because the branding is really good. Dark oxygen sounds like something that my 7-year-old knows out of Star Wars. I mean, it's a really great idea here. But it turns out that these rocks, in addition to being millions of years old and perhaps a via for a shrimp to live in, do something incredible in addition to the fact that they're as old as they are, which is that they might be producing oxygen. So what this paper, through a series of experiments, hypothesized and then published data for, was that these rocks were actually kind of performing underwater hydraulic electrolysis or hydroelectrolysis, which meant that they're basically functioning like underwater batteries. The minerals in there are creating a current, which not only means that there's enough of a current there which may affect the life that's on there, but they're actually splitting hydrogen and oxygen, hence the dark oxygen. So I told you I'd tell you a story about rocks that are breathing. It turns out that the rocks on the bottom of the seafloor might actually be producing oxygen. Now this is all preliminary, and there's now research that, via the scientific process, a number of other labs are looking at the data, trying to recreate this experiment. This original group of scientists are going back out next year to conduct more experiments. But if this is true, then everything you learned in 6th grade biology is wrong, right? The story we were told is that the great orb in the sky, the sun, hits plants photosynthesize sunlight, produce oxygen, ta-da, we get an atmosphere. Well, if these rocks are actually, doing this kind of hydroelectrolysis underwater, if they're splitting oxygen and hydrogen and creating oxygen on the water, then it really seems like a bad idea to start pulling these things off the bottom of the seafloor. And yet, that is what a growing number of companies are trying to do. Really at the lead is this particular company, the Metals Company, which is a Canadian firm that has been trying to procure permits to actually exploit this resource. So not just explore it, not just do the kind of test mining that Dr. Jason Chater rediscovered from the 1970s, but actually to bring all of these things up, crush them up, turn them into the minerals that they use potentially for batteries, which I'll come back to in a moment. So this is a potential threat that is a little bit emerging, even though it has this long legacy, and yet In April, I should say, the current administration wrote an executive order that directed NOAA to go out and to start issuing exploitation permits. And actually, the language of that allows them to do that in international waters. So let me pause there for a second, because now we get into the really wonky part of this. So just to summarize, I'd heard about this, kind of boring potato-sized rock on the bottom of the seafloor and learned that they were everywhere. And thus I was kind of like, what are we going to do with, what's the story there? And I'd learned that there had been this, older mining effort in the 70s to go out and try and find them. But now it turns out with this twist, the fact that these rocks might be producing oxygen, suddenly I was thinking, okay, well now there's something here to actually, call people's attention to what's happening on the seafloor, which again, unlike the salt marsh, is a place that really it's much easier to visit in the imagination than it is to actually visit in person. It's a really hard place to get. So the metals company has been trying to get these exploitation permits. They kind of found a chink in the armor with the current administration. And the armor is, in fact, the International Seabed Authority, the most riveting governmental organization you can imagine, which actually is it turns out is actually pretty interesting. But the ISA, as it is known, is based in Kingston, Jamaica. And they were formed as part of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So they're kind of UN adjacent, and what they really kind of do is they're like the UN of the deep sea. And over the last 20 years or so, they've been trying to figure out, all these different countries have been trying to figure out how do we actually go about exploiting, if at all, the resources of the deep sea. Because currently it's actually has the legal status, it's legally recognized as the common heritage of all mankind. It's like Antarctica or like the moon, right? Like we have kind of rules and regulations in place where you can't exploit the resources of Antarctica. It's there for, kind of for the benefit of all. That's the current status of the seafloor, and the mining companies are trying to change that. So over the course of about a year, we were following this kind of odd story about these rocks that may or may not be breathing, that are very, very old. And a month ago, I had the privilege of premiering this short film that we ended up creating about this story, actually at the ISA meeting. This story was funded by the Pulitzer Center, which funds all kinds of environmental and other kinds of crisis reporting. But we ended up receiving some funding from the Pulitzer Center and then from Pew Charitable Trust to host a screening of this short film that we ended up making, kind of exploring and explaining this rather dense concept about these rocks to the audience that has the ability to actually do something about it. So we flew down to, my reporting partner Claire Fieser and I went down to Jamaica and held a screening for about 110 different delegates from all different kinds of countries who are interested in figuring out what the next step for the deep sea is. Really trying to understand this, the kind of what their role is in legislating this, which is interesting because, the kind of the normal story of an extractive industry, like picture oil, right? Picture oil for a second. We discover it in Pennsylvania in the late 1800s, and we go gangbusters. We build an entire economy around it, and it's only 30 or 40 or 50 years later do we look back and say, wait a second, what has happened to the environment and community since then? And we start to study the effects of that. Interestingly, this is a brand new extractive industry that never has been commercially viable. Those tests from the 70s were just that, were just tests. And so we're at this kind of precarious moment where instead of looking through the rearview mirror at an extractive industry, we're looking ahead to say, is this something that we actually want to move forward with? Are our needs to electrify so great that we would, change this, this environment and perhaps change it over the course of geologic time, millions and millions of years? So we premiered the film at the ISA in July, and then we ran, the film was actually published by Scientific American. So if you have your, your pamphlet, pamphlets, or if you look for information on the speaker series and you Google my name and Scientific American, then you can see the film that will teach you more about these boring rocks on the bottom of the sea that it turns out are in fact not boring at all. So over the last couple of years, I've been able to really try to hold these kind of two things in my head, these two stories. The story of, something that is very, very kind of specific and close to us in the salt marsh, and something that is obscure and abstract and requires much more of a leap of imagination than I'm taught is appropriate. I was taught is appropriate for a journalist. So I've really had to kind of consider how to move forward with both of those, which has been a really remarkable process. And these two films, in fact, one is out in the world now via Scientific American, which should be free to access via their YouTube page. And then one will be out in the world shortly once Between Moon Tides publishes on The Guardian here in another couple of weeks. So with that, I promise to get you out of here before 6. So thank you for going on a trip with me. Appreciate it. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has any, I can go ahead and repeat them. Yeah.
Are there any public companies that are involved with dark oxygen at this point?
The metals company. So the question was, are there any public companies that are involved with the polymetallic nodules? Yes, there are two kind of right at the front that are both publicly traded. You'll saw that slide from previously here. This is the metals company opening the bell on the stock exchange. The metals company is a publicly traded company out of Canada, and there's a US-based company called Impossible Metals out of San Francisco. Those two companies are really at the forefront of building this technology and actually kind of deploying it in the deep sea. There's not a lot of other players in that space that are doing the exploitation actually commercially yet.
There must be a process that they use to extract the dark oxygen. Is that patented, or is that something some of the other companies get involved?
Yeah, so the question was, there must be a process to remove the dark oxygen. So as you clarify, the oxygen that these nodules might be producing is kind of a phenomenon that has no real value to the mining companies. The mining companies are interested in the metals within those polymetallic nodules. So the rough idea, though I will say that they actually haven't brought this to scale yet, it's not commercially viable, but the idea broadly is that you pick one of these nodules up, you crush it up, and you separate the manganese from the cobalt, from the nickel, and then can sell those minerals on a commodities market. They haven't actually built the technology to do that commercially yet, and so there's a little bit of a cart before the horse thing going on, but that happens in an extractive industry certainly. So the value to the mining companies is the minerals within them. The science actually, I should also note, was funded. The scientists that published that dark oxygen study in Nature Geosciences last year were in fact funded by the metals company. And the metals company has since, you'll have to see the film for the whole kind of shenanigans that ensues there. But the metals company was immediately started to refute the scientists' peer-reviewed findings. So that's now they're in the process of trying to publish their own rebuttal to that work that's come out. Does that clarify? There's so the question was there lithium here? All right. So here's the other. This is the quick version is no. There's no lithium here. Lithium is another type of mineral that forms in a very different environment. So the lithium kind of forms in these lake bed flats that occur on land and are kind of much easier to extract than these kinds of minerals. And so the lithium, batteries that power our phones and all that kind of stuff. Those minerals are being mined in Nevada and in South America in a different kind of context than these minerals. And interestingly, I don't know if anybody follows the electric vehicle market, but China has actually moved the battery composition, what the metals that are inside their version of a Tesla. Those metals are not these metals. They are not manganese and cobalt and nickel. They are primarily lithium, which would really devalue these rocks on the bottom of the sea, right? So the battery chemistry and that technology is evolving, even before this potential, before this industry has even really taken off. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. The question was, is there a chance that the polymetallic nodules are still growing? The short answer, as best as we reported out, was no. The actual chemistry, now there are some folks down here, on the Bay campus who would have much more expertise in this matter, in this field, but the chemical makeup of the ocean has changed over the millennia, right? So that the kind of the chemical soup, if you will, that makes up the ocean is now, it's a different recipe now. So these grew in this ancient ocean and are no longer growing because that chemistry does not exist in the ocean anymore. So the short answer is no, I don't believe so. Great question. Yeah. No, so the question was if they had figured out how removing those rocks has affected the ocean floor. So Dr. Chater is a geologist. He studies change over time. So this was a really great site for him to basically go to a construction site and see what was there and what wasn't. He is since producing this film, he's gone back out to sea and is working with colleagues who are biological oceanographers who are doing all kinds of studies to say what has any of the biodiversity or biological makeup of that nodule field. Basically, is there any biological difference between, here, where there still are plenty of undisturbed nodules, and in the middle of the train tracks? And the question is, or the answer is, we just don't know. Yeah, we know. The kind of the common phrase is we know more about the moon than we do about the deep sea. The number of people who have actually laid their eyes on the bottom of the sea is, there have been more people that have, stood on Mount Everest. It's a really, really small number of people just because it's technologically incredibly challenging to study these places. And so the scientists that we spoke to, both Dr. Chater as well as one of the scientists who published that dark oxygen study, who, lucky for us, happens to be at BU in Boston. So we went up there to go have an interview with him. They just don't know, right? This is how old the nodule. Yeah. So the rocks, you can actually. The question is, how do you know how old the rocks are? They don't use carbon dating. You can actually use a microscope, cut them in half, and then count them like tree rings. They grow like tree rings over the years, and so you can figure out. That's one method, and there's a couple of others that can date the rocks to be. Oh yes, yeah. They have done that, and they know that these rocks are in fact, millions of years old, which is pretty remarkable when you hold one in your hand. The one that I showed at the beginning there is that's the size of like a cue ball, and to think that that's been on the planet, since, for 10 million years is kind of a trip to wrap your head around, as you're like moving it around on a desk to get a shot of it. So yeah, that's another question. No, so the question was, is there a guess as to the percentage of Earth's atmosphere that may have been created via this process as opposed to the one we're all taught about photosynthesis? That's kind of the next leap. The science isn't actually there yet. First, we have to go out and kind of prove beyond a doubt that in fact the rocks are producing oxygen. So this was an early study and one that received a lot of attention. And if that finding is true, science does not move in kind of a linear pattern. It really kind of plateaus, and then you get these really big discoveries. And if this is in fact the case, if these rocks can be proven through other scientific processes, and again, this paper was peer-reviewed, so it certainly is legitimate, peer-reviewed, published in a journal, reviewed by other scientists. But if that is in fact the case, then the kind of questions like that one that would arise from the kind of the proof of that finding would, there could be, that's a whole new subfield of study, I would suspect. That's a really great question, we just don't know. So, yeah.
Why were you studying bats?
Why was I studying giant carnivorous bats? From my perspective, why wouldn't you study giant carnivorous bats? In 2015, a good friend of mine who's a National Geographic photographer and an amazing one named Anand Varma and I were sent to the place that you saw in the beginning, right? That the slideshow right at the beginning with the kind of time lapse going across. We were sent to the Yucatan Peninsula to meet up with one of the world's foremost bat ecologists, a doctor out of the UNAM, the Autonomous University in Mexico. He's named Dr. Rodrigo Medellin. And it turns out this really well-known kind of bat ecologist was really interested in whether or not giant carnivorous bats echolocated. And so the National Geographic Society gave a colleague of mine, Anand, and I a small grant to go down there and hang out with Rodrigo and try to find out. So that film is also actually available free via YouTube. It's called In Search of Zaatz. Tzotz, which was the Mayan word for bat. So I started by producing this short little film, and then National Geographic liked that idea so much that they sent me back, and I directed, produced, and shot a television special about these bats. So for that, that was right before I started at URI. So I spent about 5 months over the course of a year, spent about 5 months living in a tiny little village off the grid in the southern Yucatan Peninsula, and basically would go nocturnal for a month at a time while we would go out and try and find these bats. There's two species, both are quite large. One is about yay, and the other one's about this big. It's a hawk. And so the only way to photograph them, because it's next to impossible in the wild, Anand was able to make some photographs of them in their natural habitat, but to be able to shoot the kind of footage that you would see in this shot here, in order to get this kind of footage, you have to have them in some kind of captivity. So the natural answer to that, when you're packing for this kind of thing, is to bring a baseball, like a batting cage that you get at Walmart for $100, and to set it up in your hotel room, which isn't really a hotel room, it's like a cabin, because we're off the grid in a little village in Mexico, so it's really like a one-room cabin. So we set up a batting cage in a cabin, and then with the biologist's help, we actually caught several of these bats and kept them in our hotel room with us. So we would be sleeping on a bed pushed against the wall in a room about a quarter of this size, with a batting cage, with some kind of cheap netting that would be the only thing between us and a bat that's the size of a hawk that eats birds and rats and that kind of thing. So that's how you study giant carnivorous bats, is when you get when Rebecca Martin from National Geographic, she was at National Geographic at that time, says, "Hey, do you want to go to Mexico to hang out with a bat ecologist and study bats that are the size of hawks?" I'm not the kind of person who says, "Yeah, no, thank you." I'm like, "I'll be there in 10." Hang up the phone. So that's how. Great question. Great, thank you all. Appreciate it.